All right. Thanks for that, Jeff. So now we're going to move into the discussion part of the meeting. So I see a lot of people got their cameras switched off. So usually I have sight of people. So if people who have their cameras on can raise their hands if they want to come in with a point or ask a question. Those who don't have aren't visible, if they want to speak, can they just use the messenger, the chat function, if they want to indicate that they would like to speak or ask a question. So at this point, I'll just open it up to discussion. Yeah, Chris, you'll have to unmute.
That better?
Yep.
Okay. Hey, Jeff. Thanks for that. One of the questions I have for you, you mentioned Black Lives Matter and the way in which they were incorporated into the Democrats' electoral machine. Is there any signs that this is causing friction in what really seemed to be a huge movement? You know, is there any splits or splinters taking place, or is there any disagreement with that political line that you have come across?
Oh, you need to unmute, Jeff.
Did you want me to answer now or after?
Yeah, well, it's up to you. If there's something you want to come back on, or are you going to let the discussion run for a while and then come back at a later point? It's really your call on that.
Okay, well, let's have a couple of questions and then I'll answer and we'll go back and forth that way if it's okay with you. If not, I can answer anytime you'd like.
That's fine. John, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, I've got two questions, but I'm only asking one of them. My own opinion is, I think, Jeff, you sound as if you're over talking the continuity of the American ruling class. I mean, there are clear differences between Trump and Biden. For example, Biden, clearly is pouring in resources to try and end the coronavirus epidemic, and Trump clearly didn't give a shit whether people kept dying in their tens of thousands. So that's a fairly significant difference, I would think. And so Biden is going to try and run the system, if you like, competently, and Trump was really only looking after himself. But I suppose the question is, to what extent is the overall crisis? What is it? What is it internally? What is the nature of this crisis? I mean, one of the aspects of it is, as far as I understand it, the US spends 50% of its GDP on the military, and that's clearly, Biden has come out against a universal health system. There's the question of employment, the question of housing, the question of racial justice. From my point of view, I don't see either section of the ruling class solving those questions. But Trump is prepared to encourage semi-fascist mobilizations. When the thing about the Capitol is it wasn't the only mobilization. There were quite a number of right-wing, especially in Michigan, that basically people just ignored.
let me take up some of your questions, because I have the advantage of living in the United States and being a day-to-day full-time professional revolutionary. So you ask excellent questions. Chris, the major contradiction in Black Lives Matter was that it was basically a spontaneous movement in reaction to systemic racism. That is, a racism that saw that racist police on average murdering one Black man every single day, every day of the year. And 99.9% of the time they were not punished because they appealed their case through their so-called unions, which had negotiated contracts with cities that basically allowed them to argue that they felt their lives was threatened and they could use force and violence against anyone at any time. So the conviction rate of cops was near zero nationwide for decades. Black Lives Matter was a spontaneous movement with local youngsters grabbing a bullhorn and standing on a car or a platform, denouncing the conditions of life that the system imposed on the Black community. From A to Z, job discrimination, health care, death rates, a huge percentage of women being the first victims of COVID-19 layoffs. So when the election came, suddenly organizations that never existed appeared in the name of Black Lives Matter. And they got multi-million-dollar funding from organizations like the Ford Foundation and other corporate institutions. And they turned around and organized online conferences of 10,000 people that were oriented to get out to vote for the Democratic Party. Al Sharpton in New York City, with finances from the ruling class and the major corporations, organized the Washington, D.C. protest, supported by the NAACP and 5 or 6 major Black civil rights organizations that brought out 100,000 people. It was a Biden rally. So the so-called leadership of Black Lives Matter, with the financial support of the US ruling class, organized millions of Blacks and oppressed people to vote for the Democratic Party and banned virtually all mass action protests during the election time. More recently, we've heard that there were some potential splits in Black Lives Matter. But to date, the only thing we know is that the outs are complaining that they didn't get their share of the $1 million that were distributed to some 20 different Black Lives Matter NGOs. We haven't seen any political differentiation. That's the music of the future, but I think that music is coming. As far as John's question about clear differences, from your point of view, in Ireland, that may seem to be obvious because Biden posed himself as a liberal and Trump was an open, far-right, reactionary, lying, racist moron. But Joseph Biden's record is the record of an open, reactionary, racist moron. Joseph Biden, for his 30-some-odd years in government, was the representative of the U.S. Southern slavocracy in the Democratic Party, who traditionally organized a Northern liberal like Kennedy to run with a vice presidential candidate like Texas Senator Lyndon Johnson. It was Biden who gave the major eulogy at Strom Thurmond's memorial meeting. Strom Thurmond was the racist, right-wing segregationist bigot who opposed all of the civil rights legislation, who threatened to break from the Democratic Party, who oversaw the racist Klan and Citizen Council attacks on Black people. That combination of Northern liberals and Southern Democrats has been the norm of the Democratic Party until Nixon. And Nixon developed a, quote, Southern strategy that won over the Southern racist bigots into the Republican Party. So if the Democrats were ever to win an election, they had to run their own Southern racist bigot. So they picked Jimmy Carter or Al Gore or Bill Clinton, all from Southern states. Jimmy Carter, who poses as a liberal human rights activist, was the last Southern governor to agree that Nixon had to go. He pleaded with Nixon to stay in office despite the scandals. He was first elected as a Southern racist school board official who bused white kids past Black schools so they wouldn't have to walk. His record, he was not a human rights fighter. He was a commodities exchange speculator who got rich off segregation. And the same thing with Al Gore. His father was a notorious Southern racist bigot. And Bill Clinton came from wherever it was, Arkansas. That was the only way the Democrats could pick up a few, quote, electoral college votes to win the presidency, to assure the Southern racist Democrats who had deserted that they were safe Southern racist senators and candidates for the Democratic Party. On Biden and the pandemic, let me tell you this, as shocking as it would be. The question for the US ruling class across both parties was their own contradiction. If they didn't have their workers back to work, they couldn't have profits. They understood that workers are the central source of profits. So all 50 governors, Democrat and Republican, across the political spectrum, argued that they had to ignore the pandemic and send workers back to work, regardless of the conditions that they suffered. And of course, the service sector, the poorest of the poor, the people in the meatpacking and food industries, who were a huge percentage immigrants, were forced back to work by Democrat and Republicans. It's no coincidence that the highest rate of pandemic of COVID-19 in the United States is in liberal California. California, if ranked by GDP, would be the 5th or 6th richest nation on earth. And its bourgeoisie, which are among the richest in the world, insisted that its workers go back to work. In every case, it was bipartisan. The capitalist class subordinated human needs and safety to myths about how you could safely get back to work. In state after state, they had poor and immigrant and Black and Latino workers standing elbow to elbow without any protection or masks, even entering the job with fevers, because capitalism needed a workforce to be profitable. The same thing with Governor Cuomo in New York, another Democrat. His debate and all of the others was, how can we get our wage slaves back to work? And when they couldn't, they joined with the Trump administration to pass unprecedented bailout bills that were virtually unanimous in Congress that bailed out the ruling rich. So for both parties, it was a bipartisan effort and will still be that. Even today, Biden is promising to open the schools because they want to free the parents from childcare responsibilities and send them back to the America's factories and schools. And they are opposed by the major teacher unions in the United States that represent millions of teachers who understand that if they're being forced back to work with no protection, no proper ventilation, no guarantee of masks. They're going to die from COVID-19. So these pro-Democratic Party unions are already bucking the Biden administration. It's true that Trump looked out for himself because he thought he could bully certain layers of the world imperialist system into submission by basically imposing his own tariffs on Chinese and even Canadian and European goods to advantage his own sections of the ruling class. But there was minimal opposition on the part of the ruling class to that. They all went along because he orchestrated the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department to provide them with billions, if not trillions of dollars in bailout money. All of those bills, including Trump's famous tax relief plan, were bipartisan in nature.
All right, Jeff, I just got a few more people indicating, so if we go back into the discussion, then I'll let you in again.
Okay, let's go back to the discussion.
Yeah, so I've got someone off camera who's indicated using the hand up symbol. So anybody off camera can use that if they want to indicate that they want to come in. So Maxim?
Yes.
Me, Jonathan.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
First, I'd like to say comrade Mackler for telling us about the situation in the United States. It's rather enlightening. I find it rather enlightening because it's the reality is in stark contrast to what our Russian liberals US to be. They, tell us lies about that US is some sort of paradise where everyone is happy when it's clearly not. And I have a question about the sorry state of the American left. Am I correct to assume that the modern pseudo-leftists in the United States are a bunch of spineless cowards who actually hate the working class to their core?
Yeah. So another indicator, right? Yeah, Brian, you can come in now.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. Thanks for that, Jeff. Pretty realistic, but a bit depressing. The analysis. I get what it's like. I mean, you obviously live there. I don't. I live in Belfast. And what we had a lot when I had the time to read about it was obviously CNN coverage. I never watched Fox. I think that Trump said social media, everything amplified, lots and lots of noise. Meanwhile, the death from coronavirus was going up, huge numbers. And you talked there about workers having to get back. So that's one thing I think. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but when you do have an epidemic, it tends to, if you want to look at it, it tends to illuminate and reinforce existing divisions in society. You see that in terms of the number of black people die, the working class, just how it impacts. It's not that we're all in this together. But what I'm interested about is not so much what's going on in the Democratic Party. I mean, workers are, a lot of them are not stupid. They've seen what's going on. They've seen they've had to go to work. They've not got protection. Where's the optimism for struggle being renewed in America on a class basis? Do you have any optimism that this can come about?
Let me answer your questions. They're all fascinating questions. But Chris, your last one, you won't find a more optimistic person for the socialist revolution than me and my party. Where we are the eternal optimists, but not based on some blind optimism, but based on the kinds of questions that John asked. American capitalism is at crisis and it has no choice. It's inherent in the system. They have a constant pressure on the rate of profit. And in order to counter it, they have to constantly introduce new machinery, which in the long run, based on competition, ends up lowering the rate of profit. So they respond with speed up, with immigrant hiring, with offshoring jobs, with the pension destruction, with cuts in healthcare. and all of the other measures to keep capitalism going at the expense of workers. The fact that we had 20 million people mobilize this summer, the largest protest in history, wasn't just over police brutality. That was the issue that sort of broke the camel's back because it was commonplace in all the communities of the oppressed. But working people are hurting, and they are fighting back. Not only a nationwide auto strike that was sold out by the bureaucrats, but the workers, 250,000, showed they had the power to stop production. The teachers' strikes have been inspiring. Last year, we had statewide strikes that closed down entire states, unprecedented in US history, because teachers are in the front line. And why did the teachers strike? Because the various state legislatures, in this case, the teacher strikes were overwhelmingly in Republican states, because the state legislatures, in order to bail out failing capitalism, took the money in state taxes and other income out of public services and gave it directly to the real estate corporate interests. And the teachers had a simple demand. We have your goddamn budget. This is how much you took. And we want you to take the 10 or 15 or 30 billion that you transferred from them to us, back from us to them, back to us. So they struck because they knew exactly where the money was, and they knew exactly who was oppressing them. All of the evils that we have are a result of a failing capitalism that has had a devastating effect on workers. En masse, they've lost their pensions. They're being casualized as far as workforce. They're part-time, gig economy, low-wage jobs are the norm. A huge percentage of the jobs that are created are low wage in the United States. Would you believe that the minimum wage, which still is paid to 1 million workers, is $7.25? Even Biden has to promise that they would raise the minimum wage to 15. And last week, the ruling class said, no way. So he dropped it from his budget program, saying we'll deal with the minimum of $15 an hour. And down the toilet went his wage program. On the question of the dead, here we have United States, the richest, most powerful country in the world, literally first in the world in the number of deaths. Yesterday, the president went on national TV to commemorate 500,000 dead from COVID-19 in the richest country on earth. That's roughly 1 out of 4 of all the dead in the world. And the United States has 29 million cases and still hasn't been able to distribute to its 340 million people more than 1,000 COVID vaccinations in a day. Here you have a country that can organize itself in the face of the worst pandemic in the modern era. And Biden has barely exceeded Trump. They say that he's now averaging 1.5 million shots a day. So we have some incredible problems facing us. And now the most important question: what is the state of the American left? Yes, it's formally dissipated into the Democratic Party, into Bernie Sanders, into the DSA, into Joseph Biden. Groups like ISO have disappeared. Solidarity have virtually disappeared. And groups like Socialist Alternative, which had its origins in UK politics, collected 60,000 signatures online asking Bernie Sanders, a lifelong Democrat, to run as an independent representative of working people. So yes, in my lifetime, including in the McCarthy era, I've never seen the organized left in such a sorry state. But I'll tell you, in my lifetime, I have never seen a more angry working class. a greater receptivity to socialist ideas. The statistic that I gave you, repeated by poll after poll, that a majority of the young people under 30, and now it's under 39, because that's an old poll, prefer socialism over capitalism. For them, socialism represents an egalitarian, humanistic sharing idea. At worst, something that is alleged to exist in the Scandinavian countries, as opposed to capitalism that has nothing but misery in store for working people. So
All
we
right,
have
Jeff, I've just had a few more indications.
Let's finish this last idea,
Yeah.
and I'll go back to your questions. We have a giant contradiction between the massive anger and frustration of the broad working class and the oppressed nationalities and women on the one hand, and organized fight back on the other. I fully expect in the months ahead, if not the years ahead, that contradiction to give rise to opportunities to recruit and rebuild a revolutionary left. These things come all of a sudden. No one expected the 1929 crisis, world economic crisis, to result in immediate changes. And in 1934, 5 years into the Depression, a handful of American Trotskyists led a general strike in Minneapolis that paved the way to the CIO. And a Stalinized Communist Party organized a general strike in San Francisco. And a group of revolutionaries in Toledo, Ohio. Those 3 strikes paved the way for the greatest labor upsurge in the United States. Workers who had very little experience, Southern Black workers who were brought up to break the steel strikes in the 1920s, and right-wacist Klans workers who were brought up to cool the radicalization in the 30s, turned out to be trade union brothers and sisters and built the most powerful fight back trade union movement in the history of the United States. Sudden change. And I have to add this one thing, if you forgive me. An old friend of mine named Vladimir Lenin was rowing a boat on a Swiss lake in January 1917, and then lecturing to students at the university, saying that he was an old man and wouldn't live to see the revolution that he had spent his life on. A month later, he started making his way back to Russia, where the working class surprised the world in a backward country and set the example for revolutionaries everywhere. These changes are an accumulation in the consciousness of working people. Yes, we had Black Hundreds in Russia, but we also had a revolutionary party in exile that had patiently built itself based on the working class and defending all their struggles, whether it be the struggles of the university students or the struggles of the peasantry. They had a program to answer the immediate needs of the working class and the oppressed, and they emerged victorious. Our revolutionary left has the same potential today. Capitalism has no solution. It won't run over the American working class when it's fighting, and the same thing with the working class everywhere.
All right, thanks, Jeff. So I've had an indication from Anne.
Oh, sorry. Pardon me. I just wanted to actually ask Jeff, what are the issues that are actually have given rise to the dissolution of the ISO and the general demise of the left in the United States? I mean, you answered some of the issues I was going to ask, so I'm just wondering. And has there been any realignment or anything like that? Thanks.
More questions?
Yep. So anyone who hasn't come in, people can come in again if they want to, but anyone who hasn't come in, very much encourage them to make a contribution. If you're on camera, just indicate with your hand, and if you're off camera, you can use the raised hand icon. So yeah, we're going to take Dave Jackson next.
Yeah, I think you probably covered a lot of maybe what I wanted to refer to, but yeah, it seems that yeah, I think it concerns me in a way, because it concerns me the fact that I think from the experience of revolutionary parties, and over decades, I think what we find is, as Jeff was saying, that when the working class can move very quickly, and situations can be transformed very quickly. But unfortunately, if Jeff was referring to 1917 there, and obviously the Bolshevik Party was ready in a way, because it had it did have quite a good organization that had already built up. So, but one of the worrying things about the revolutionary left at the present time is that that organization and that sort of focus of how to build and where we should be building doesn't seem to exist, which is a result of the pressures of capitalism, I would say. It's not a result of, it's not just the left's fault, that they made these mistakes and this is where we're at. If you look at the defeat of Corbyn, where a lot of British groups dissolved themselves into the Labour Party, and when of course in the sort of optimism of the moment, what you find is Corbyn was defeated utterly by a combination of the right-wing media, and also the fact that the Labour Party didn't use its base, because it's an electoral party. So what we're saying is, in many places around the world, is revolutionary groups, in a way, dissolving themselves into electoral strategies. That's not really, to me, that's a basic flaw, as far as a revolutionary strategy is concerned, because it's not in Parliament. It's not in Parliament that's going to be that those changes are going to come from. It's going to be the on the ground. So as far as the question is concerned, just wondering if Jeff would, Jeff, maybe you could comment on how would you build at the present time, so that we can be ready for when the working class struggles happen in the next few years. How would you be ready anyway, your party?
All right, so got another indication from Maxim. You want to come in again?
Well, yes, I just like to say that the fact that American workers are absolutely infuriated about the state of capitalism and their opposition to it is growing is very inspiring to me and the comrades in my party, because the same thing is happening in Russia. The country is going downhill very fast, and the proletarians are also mad about it, and more and more of them are turning to the left, and no party is as optimistic about the tremendous trends as my party, the Revolutionary Workers' Party of Russia. And I'll be sure to pass the word about some sort of international solidarity, because it would be also very inspiring to my comrades. The capitalists wrongly assume that no force can challenge them. We will prove them wrong one day.
All right, John again. You have to unmute, John.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. What I want to focus in on is something that I think it was Lukehouse, interpreting Lenin, talked about the imminence of the revolution. So it's not enough to say people are really angry, things really aren't working, and someday there'll be a revolution. We have to have some sort of picture of how we're going to arrive there. And I want to take as an example the Texas. I mean, the Texas catastrophe is at a certain level unbelievable. You know, in the richest country in the world, in one of the richest states, you know, just this rolling collapse of the whole social infrastructure. And even when it collapses, there's not really state organizations to step in and ameliorate the crisis. So what you can say about that is, if that runs too far, you know, police stations will be burning down. You know, the working class aren't passive. So at a certain point, you know, if they see no alternative, they act very, very quickly. Now the problem is that to a certain extent, the workers, and certainly the vast majority of the union and socialist movements, are attached to a model where capitalist reform can deliver progress for the workers. And I think what the problem is that we're past that period. We're past a period where substantial, because capitalism has declined, it's not in a situation where it's going to generate a more modern society, a better society, or even pick up a wee bit in society. So I would say that for the revolutionaries, there's sort of two tasks. One is to popularize our picture of the world, to popularize the picture of a world in crisis, a world where the rate of profit continues to fall, where the level of differentiation of wealth increasingly goes upwards towards the rich, where the people. And we have to find some method of theoretical unity across the globe, and that's one of the problems. The existing socialist organizations aren't fulfilling that role.
All right. So, do you want to come in again? You've still got the hand icon up, so something you want to come in again, or no? So is anyone else? I'm just going to draw this discussion section to an end. We're coming up on the hour mark, so if anyone else wants to come in for one last point, to make a point, or to ask the question, I'd ask them to do so. No, well, in that case, I'll move to the summary part of the meeting. So